You have questions, we have answers. This is Jane Miller.
And this is Ken Miller. Welcome to our show, all about real estate with Ken and Jane. Today's show, Jane, we're going to talk about rental tips and tricks.
That's really important.
For the landlords, that's beneficial for both the landlords and tenants.
Yes.
What we mean by that is oftentimes leases don't address everything. We've experienced that firsthand by having managed many properties, rental properties, being involved in 100 rental transactions per year. So we've developed a list of things, just good housekeeping practices, things that every landlord and tenant should be aware of, and try to cross the T's and dot the I's so that everything is covered. Because when something is not covered, it certainly comes around to bite
Haunt
you.
you.
Haunt you. Right. Haunt
Yes,
you, right.
absolutely. Yeah.
So one of the things is, this is more for the landlords to know. Agents know that, but sometimes landlords rent their houses or their units by themselves. Every town in New Jersey, when there's a change of occupancy, there's supposed to be either a CO, certificate of occupancy, or a fire inspection at the minimum that the township usually requires. That's to protect the safety of the tenant. Certain towns like East Brunswick require just the fire inspection, which would entail making sure that you have the required number and type of smoke detectors, carbon monoxide detectors, and a fire extinguisher. However, other towns like in Central Jersey, North Brunswick are much more stringent, and they require actually a rental inspection by a department there, the Community Development Department, where they go into the unit and they check not only for the fire compliance, they check for safety hazards, for cleanliness, for caulking, the windows, the doors, painting, and just a general. They want the house to be at a certain habitable level.
And also on top of that, you're absolutely right, Ken. Certain township even write down how many people allowed, especially in New Brunswick. They will write on CCO, the certificate, how many people allowed, because they want to have the standard. For example, the basement, right? If you have a window, but the window may not be egress window, so you still need a second access for. Once again, there's all safety concerns, safety reasons to protect the tenant and resident there. So obviously, you have to check with the local township to make sure to get a proper paperwork and approvals before the tenant can take residency, right? I mean, it happened to me many years. So you have to have the inspection first before you allow tenant move in. There's a gray area if they put their staff in, whether they move in or not. But why take the chance, right? You better get. I always do is I have to have a completely certificate sign off in my hand before I let the tenant put anything in the house, because that's a gray area. I didn't live there, but can I put my luggage, my suitcase, or some of my furniture? So why put yourself in that situation? Just get the approval first to protect yourself and also protect the tenant in the long run. Yes.
Absolutely. And as we covered on prior shows, just the fire safety is such an important part that everybody should have the smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors in place. Whether you're a listener that's been in your house for a long time and is not a landlord or a tenant, if you're just the occupant, please check your home, your unit, and make sure you have a working smoke detectors and carbon monoxide. Those are life safety things. They're not that expensive. You can get them at the hardware stores, the Home Depot, the Lowe's, but they're a must, and they will protect you, and they're a lifesaver. So,
absolutely. And now I think the rules changed. They want to use the sealed battery 10 years, right?
Yes.
But in the past, we always recommend the people every year in fall or spring, you should check your battery, change your battery at least once a year.
Right.
So, but now the new rule is they have the 10 years sealed battery.
Right. That rule applies for the smoke detectors. The carbon monoxide detectors still have the batteries that are not the 10-year. However, the smoke detectors under New Jersey, they changed the law fairly recently. They now require that any smoke detector to get the certificate has to be a 10-year sealed battery smoke detector, meaning that it's good for 10 years. That was a legislative initiative that was done.
Yeah,
I think it's a good idea because they figured what happened in the past, unfortunately, was that once the smoke detector batteries started chirping, people would not always change them, and then they would the smoke detector would be rendered useless because there had no batteries. So that's more of an upgrade to ensure that there's continuity in the function of the smoke detector.
Absolutely. Yes.
Another important item landlords need to know is that check with your township on registration. Every township usually requires that the landlord fill out a registration form, a landlord-tenant registration form that contains the information on the unit, who the landlord is. If they're in county, they need an emergency contact. If they're out of county, they need somebody in county who's the contact. That's called the landlord-tenant registration form. Mm-hmm. It's quite important to file that because the township needs it. And also, it's from a legal perspective, if you don't file that, it can come into play if you had to unfortunately, if you had to remove a tenant and you don't have that form on file, that could be a defense to the anti-eviction of a tenant. That's one of the
Yes, very
things.
important. And thirdly, Ken, that's a very good point. And to do that, thirdly, I think you should check with your HOA as well, because if the home is have HOA, because certain HOA change rules, right? And you as a homeowner may not be updated. For example, recently there's a few community voted to change no rental, right? Some community, if you bought before certain time, you may be grandfather in, but others, it's not. You only grandfather in if your unit was rented by a certain time, right? So even you say you bought a house 2005, you live there for 15 years, right? It's for all these years, but the time you need to move just happened, the community changed the rules and you cannot rent. You can't say I bought it so long ago, but it's really the time they make a past resolution no longer allowed to rent is that time, whether your unit is rented or not, you investor or self-occupied. So that's very important because and another thing is a certain community have a certain rules. For example, certain community has a no pet, right? So you have to really understand the rules. You have to contact either the homeowner or the agent. As you said, some owner may do themselves. So they have to contact the association, get the handbook and knowing what's allowed, what's not allowed. Furthermore, once you secure a tenant, you have to give them the rules so they know. For example, you're not allowed to put a trash out the night before, for example, right? Mm-hmm. And, you have to do it in the morning or something like for us, for people, it's a common sense, but other people may not, right? Like you can't hang the clothes in the balcony.
Right.
So
I think what you're saying is very true. The rules, giving the tenant the information, whether it be the bylaws and the rules, is very important because oftentimes the lease will say that the tenant must abide by all the local municipal rules as well as the association rules if you live in an association. However, if you never provide the tenant with the rules handbook or the bylaws, then the tenant can't be expected to know the rules. So you have to give them the rules, like you mentioned with the trash. That's often a common thing, that the trash, also the location of the trash cans. So oftentimes associations disallow the trash cans when they're empty. They must be stored either inside a garage or in the back or the side of the unit and not displayed in the front. And they have to be promptly, there's certain times with time limits where you can put the trash out and you have to bring it after it's collected. You have to bring it back within a certain time. So you're right. That's all regulated
regulated by each HOA. So check with the management company. So
right. And what you said about investors is key. If you're an investor, meaning you're buying the unit to rent out, of course, the first step before you make an offer is to check to make sure the association make sure the bylaws of the association allow you to rent the unit. You don't want to be in the situation going under contract and finding out that it's owner-occupied requirement.
It happened last year. The story was the agent wasn't familiar with it. That would happen to East Brunswick Society too, right? And at the end, I got a call from an agent asked me, "Do you know that?" I said, "Yes, absolutely." But because the agent herself is not in the area, so she got the listing. She sold to the investor. The investor, once again, the agent should contact HOA, find out, or the lawyer or the investor himself. Everybody dropped the ball in that sense. So they closed. So
And there are many ways, right?
The investor bought it.
And there are many ways to protect yourself, just thinking out a little bit outside the box. When the offer is made, you can have your agent, if it's presented by a realtor, they can handwrite in the contract, the realtor contract, that's subject to being allowed to invest it. The lawyer can put that in his or her attorney review letter. But there are ways you can protect yourself in writing, making the offer contingent upon until you can verify that. If you don't have time to verify that 110% before you put the offer in, certainly when you put the offer in, you can request that written. You can put that written contingency in place.
Yeah, but this case, everybody dropped the
ball.
ball.
So
they
then,
closed. After they closed, they want to rent the house because after close, you have to contact the association, fill in the owner information sheet. By then, they found out. They said, "Well, look, we already purchased." After we said, "Absolutely not." So the new owner forced to put a house on the market to sell. Can you imagine the cost? You have to buy the unit, the lawyer fee, inspection, the title, and then when you sell, the commission, the transfer tax. But luckily, the market went up, so he went out okay. Can you imagine the other way around? And then he was definitely going to sue his agent, sue everybody in that case, sue his lawyer. But luckily, the market was on the rise early last year, so he came out okay. So, but that's just lucky, right? As an agent, as the buyer yourself and the owner yourself, you should really do the diligence. Yeah.
You have to. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Another thing we were talking about is utilities. Oftentimes, the leases address the common utilities, electric and gas, usually are the responsibility of the tenant. Oftentimes, water and sewer are also the responsibility of the tenant. However, one item that it varies by township is the garbage and recyclables. Sometimes different towns, some it's included with the taxes, and therefore it's a non-issue. It's extended to the tenants by virtue of the township. However, other municipalities have private garbage collection. In that case, you don't want to let that fall through the cracks too. So the lease, if that's a private service for garbage and recyclable, you have to make sure that the lease addresses that who's going to pay for that.
Who's going to open the account to pay for it. And another thing about a utility can be very important. Say if your tenant lease ends the end of January 31st, but they move out on the 17th, right? As an owner, you have to make sure communicate with the previous tenant or current tenant. Because who's going to keep the utility? By lease, I think the tenant's supposed to keep it until the 31st or the new tenant took over, right? And whatever come closer. But a certain tenant didn't know that. Nobody notified them. So they thought, I moved out. I give the key back to the landlord. So that's it. So they just cut off the utility. Think about it. In January, February, if the tenant cut off the utility and, it may take a few days if it's storm to put it back on and the damage could make, because no heat. So that's very important. Clarify. It's not like good and bad
black
people.
And white, but just
that's just
clarify, right.
miscommunication. So very important. Make sure the landlord can have landlord-tenant account, utility account. So when the tenant take out their name and your name
it automatically reverts back. All right, great. Good stuff. We're going to take a short break. We'll be right back after these messages. Okay, welcome back to our show. We're covering landlord and tenant tips to ensure you have a smooth relationship with your tenant and landlord. So we spoke about a few things already. Let's move on to another hot topic that can come up, which is landlord personal belongings that are left in a unit. What I mean by the personal belongings are things such as paintings, plants, furniture. Sometimes the landlords, for whatever reason, they may have you usually encounter this when the landlord had previously occupied this space and then they move out and then they decide, we have plants that are very, that sit well in the unit, or we have paintings that go well with the decor. So they decide to leave those things in the unit. And sometimes, and there's an expectation then that at least in the landlord's mind, there's an expectation that the tenant will come in and will, keep those things and maintain them and, take care of the plants, water them, and leave the plants where they are, regardless of whatever the tenant's, furniture situation is and preferences are. So that's the expectation. But again, it's a gray area, and the landlord's perception and expectation does not always equate to what the tenant has in their mind.
Yeah, that's recently happened to us, unfortunately. The landlord left the plant and Chinese lucky plant to the tenant. They wish them well. The first tenant have no problem, accept it and love it. And then a few years later, the first tenant move out, the second tenant move in. So the landlord said, this plant is very lucky, brought us luck, brought the previous tenant's luck, we want to keep here. So the tenant said, okay. So they did, I believe, didn't say anything there because they're polite. They didn't want to say anything. And but from the tenant perspective, that was a gift. And they did try to say, you can take it, but landlord said, no, insist, this bring you luck, come on, just put it there. So I think from the landlord perspective, they think they explained very clearly that's part of the house and for you to maintain from landlord perspective. But from the tenant perspective, they thought that was a gift. Enforce the gift. They didn't want it because they had a very busy schedule. They didn't want it. So long story short, and the tenant gave the plant away to a friend because they really have no time to take care of it. And here comes the final walkthrough. The landlord demand that plant. And there was a big, upset from both parties. At the end, even though the tenant, agent agreed to compensate something, but the landlord said, no, I want my plant back, which is impossible. We don't even know whether the plant's still alive, at that point because they gave away to a friend as a gift. We don't know what happened. But as a landlord agent, that's the part. That was I wasn't really understood myself. That was a part of the thing. I thought, to be honest, that could be a gift too, right? But at the end, it was a miscommunication. It's very important for the landlord and tenant. It's not good people, bad people, reasonable people, not reasonable people. Rather, it's communication have to be clear, right? It's what's agreement versus expectation.
Right. And of course, certainly the lease can't address all these situations. But then what you do is normally what we're going to cover. You usually have a pre-move-in walkthrough, and there's a sheet where the typical purpose of the pre-move-in walkthrough is to record and document anything wrong with the property, whether there be paint chips, nicks, caulking missing, a damaged sink. But that would be the appropriate place to document the expectation. If there's plants that are left, then I guess if it's important to both sides, everything should be documented in writing to the extent possible, so there's no miscommunication or misunderstanding. A year later, 2 years later, when the tenant moves out, and then there's memories become faded. What the landlord recalls isn't what the tenant recalled. So I know, and sometimes like you said, tenants are polite and they say yes, and thank you, but in their minds they're thinking, gee, I really don't want the plants, or I have no space for the plants, or I was planning to put my computer desk where these plants are because they were quite large. So just to avoid any misunderstanding and later problems, it's best to document it in the pre-move-in walkthrough.
Yeah. Another thing is like some owner may leave the furniture in the house, right? I always tell my owner, right? If you leave your beautiful dining table and you maybe put a cover, you may be careful, but when you leave in the house, right, what's reasonable wear and tear is different from family to family, right? Even within the same family, right, Ken? Sure. My mom's wear and tear is after she purchased anything, after 10 years, look brand new.
Or in better condition than
condition than it was, right? That's my mom's expectation. It's my mom's agreement with you, okay? But for us, we relax the family. We bought a beautiful, high-end table. Our daughter just go in there, dining table, just go there, do her homework. I have to say, hey, you have to put something underneath. You're going to write on my expensive table, But it's just different. So if you leave your furniture behind, and for you expect the return the way same way you were, that's almost impossible. Certain times we did had a family leave something, the tenant actually make it better. That's happened too, but that's a good ending, right?
And then with getting with the furniture, then you run into more issues. What if the couch gets cut, the leather gets split, gets food stains on it? What if their paintings left behind, which has happened before, or the property of the landlord. What if a child bumps against the painting, it drops, the frame breaks, the cracks. So there's just a lot of things to consider from both the landlord perspective as well as the tenant perspective. There's other issues. So that becomes, so it's best to clarify, what, and I would suggest as a landlord, it's best if you really to take your personal property with you and to the extent possible and not leave it behind, because you're only opening yourself up to future problems with.
If you leave, that's the thing you don't want. You want to leave behind. I normally negotiate if the tenant said, I want you, if the landlord want to leave furniture, tenant said yes. I always make sure, ask landlord, that's furniture you don't want, right? So when the tenant finish, I always put in lease addendum. When the tenant is finished, they are responsible to take the furniture with them or dispose the furniture. Think about it, Ken. If the landlord moved to London, right, left a lot of furniture, the current tenant say, oh, that's great. I just got a job transfer from Chicago. So that's great. I have everything. But they live there 2-3 years and they're going to go. And the next tenant may not want the furniture. They may just move 5 blocks down, right? They may have their own furniture. So that time, the landlord is in London, and who's going to pay and coordinate to get rid of all the furniture? It's costly too, a few $1,000s easily to get rid of everything, right? So I always tell the landlord, if you want to sell before you leave, you sell them, you take with you, whatnot. If you live in the house, better negotiate with the tenant. They're going to be responsible for their lease. And if their new tenant accept that, that's fine. Put in the new lease, the tenant lease, right? They have to responsible to dispose them, right, or take away with them. So in that way, you don't have to worry. If you are here, it's easier for you to organize it. But if you're gone out of the area, that's going to be more responsibility later on, disappointment too. So.
Sure, it could be a very complicated issue, right?
Yes.
When you pass it from tenant A to tenant B, and then the issue becomes if tenant A likes the furniture and wants to take it, but tenant B wanted it, but you have to just clarify the expectations. If once the landlord vacates, if the furniture belongs to the first tenant who's there, then that tenant has the right to the ownership and can do with it what he or she pleases. But then they have to remove it at the end of the lease, so the property is turned over and empty to the tenant,
smoothly,
the second tenant B. Mm-hmm. That's very important.
Yep. Another tips, Ken, I really want to talk about is the maintenance of the lawn.
That was my next. You're reading my mind. That was the next thing. Yep, that was reading my mind. Yeah. So, oftentimes the realtor lease addresses, the tenant's response. If you have a single-family house, the landlords usually put the burden of the lawn maintenance on the tenant in terms of grass cutting. Tenant shall cut the grass. However, this leaves a lot. This is a very general term. Cutting the grass is cutting the grass, and most tenants take it literally, where they're going to cut the grass and keep it at a reasonable height. However, lawn maintenance, if the landlord has the expectation of lawn maintenance, that involves typically fertilizing the lawn, weed control, shrub trimming, mulching. These are all things that it's best to spell out. We had a situation where fortunately this was spelled out in a lease. The tenant neglected to do some of the lawn maintenance, but the landlord reverted back to the lease and had clear and concise language stating, the tenants neglected these responsibilities, so the tenant agreed,
that was a few thousand. It was a few
$1,000. So if you're a landlord and you have a house and you have an expectation of this, you have to be clear. And not only should it be clear in the lease, but it should be clear at the time you advertise the property through your realtor, so the tenant is not surprised
or by yourself
with those expectations. They know the rent is X amount, and it includes the requirements that tenant do X, Y, and Z. If there are things that are a little bit extraordinary, if you want the tenant to have a lawn maintenance plus the weed control plus the mulching plus trim the shrubs, and that all should be spelled out.
Yeah, that's no right or wrong answer, Ken. As you said, that's really agreement between the landlord and tenant. I always tell the landlord, sure, they should make sure the weed has to be done, the control of the the shrubs that should be done, but make the property beautiful. It shouldn't be the burden of the tenant. For example, if they every couple of years or every year they put a new mulch on, I always tell the landlord I represent, I said, you should pay for at least for the material, if not the whole thing, because you want to maintain, you want the neighborhood, keep up with the neighborhood and do the right thing. That shouldn't be on the tenant, because tenant cut the grass and keep the weed, and that's good. But anything additional,
Right.
yeah, we should do it.
Another example would be power washing. A lot of homes need to be power washed every 2 to 3 years because they develop moss and
depends on the facing.
Depends
Some
on the facing.
house,
If it's not facing the sunlight, they can tend to develop the moss, the mildew, the mold, and that's something that usually we tell the owners that that's their responsibility, unless the lease was very specific to require the tenant to do it, because that's more of a something that's
maintenance,
really a maintenance thing for the house, and that's not really something
that's your house.
That's
you
your house,
as an investor, your best interest to protect your own asset.
Correct.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
To be a fair landlord. Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. So the main thing is to be clear and concise and objective up front. So there's you can iron out a lot of these confusions with that.
Absolutely. Yes.
Right. So we had a swimming pool was another one I wanted to talk about too, real quick.
Very important.
That was a very important one. Oftentimes tenants, this applies for your single-family rental homes. They have a swimming pool, whether it be an above-ground pool or an underground pool. It's very important. We don't have much time. We'll just recap on it. Again, the expectation has to be if the pool is delivered closed, there has to be some agreement as to who's responsible for opening and closing the pool, for maintaining the pool, for cleaning the pool, and
repair the pool.
Yeah. So these are all things that have to be. A lot of times it's left there. It's not addressed, and then the tenant says, "Well, I want the pool open. It's summertime," and the landlord says, "Well, go ahead and open it," and the tenant says, "Well, you got to provide me the pool. I'm paying you rent, so open it and get it ready, and I want to swim." So these are very, very important things.
It's all about come back. What you said, Ken, is expectation versus agreement. So sometimes, that's really people has to make sure they're on the same page here, right? I mean, what you said may not be the other person understand of what you said. So that's very important. You said, well, there's a swimming pool, but as you said, you should document it when they're advertising whose responsibility, and in the lease certainly have to document that. The more precise and clear the communication at the beginning, the better ongoing in the later.
Less headaches on the beginning. All right, very good, Jane. We're out of time. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll see everyone next week. Enjoy your rest of the weekend.
Thank you.